We need to talk 4 simple words. 4 words that, in the silent, digital space of a text message, can feel heavier than a 1,000-page novel. They can be an invitation, a confession, or they can be a warning, an omen, a single, trembling matchstick struck in a room filled with gasoline. For most of the U.S., this text is a dreaded, stomach-dropping prelude to a difficult conversation, an argument about money, the end of a relationship. It's the beginning of a long, painful night. But for Allison Graves, IT was the beginning of the end. It was the last text she would ever send. From the outside, the marriage of Allison and Peter Graves wasn't just happy. It was perfect. They lived in a sprawling, colonial home in the affluent, tree-lined suburb of Northwood, Connecticut, a town where success wasn't just expected. IT was the baseline. Peter was a high-flying financial consultant, charismatic, handsome, a pillar of community. Allison was the brilliant, beautiful, and dedicated mother to their 2 wonderful children, the woman who made their perfect life run with effortless grace. They were the couple everyone wanted to be, the ones who hosted the best dinner parties, who still held hands on their evening walks, whose Christmas cards were a flawless portrait of the American dream. But on a rainy Tuesday in October, that portrait shattered. Allison Graves, a woman defined by her meticulous planning and unwavering devotion to her children, vanished. She didn't show up to pick up her daughter from ballet. Her phone went straight to voicemail. Her car was gone. The only clue? A single text message sent her husband, Peter, just hours earlier. "We need to talk." When detectives began to peel back the layers of this perfect marriage, they found something else entirely. They found a rotten foundation, eaten away by years of infidelity, staggering financial deceit, and a dark, hidden world of lies. And what they would ultimately uncover was a chilling, meticulous plan for revenge, a plan that had been set in motion long before that final, fateful message was ever sent, a plan that would prove to be Allison's undoing, and, in a final, tragic twist, the only thing that could bring her killer to justice. This is a story of a marriage built on a lie, a wife who saw the truth, and the last text she ever sent. To understand the tragic end of Allison and Peter Graves, you have to understand the flawless beginning they presented to the world. Northwood, Connecticut, is a place that prides itself on quiet, OLD money elegance. It's a world of pristine lawns, 100-year-old oak trees, and a social pressure that is as thick as the humid New England summers. Your life wasn't just lived. IT was curated. And no one curated a better life than Allison and Peter. Allison was, by all accounts, exceptional. She was 41, with a sharp, analytical mind and a warmth that drew people in. Before she had children, she'd been a forensic accountant at a top-tier firm in Manhattan. She was a woman who lived in the details, who could spot a lie in a balance sheet from a mile away. Her colleagues from that time described her as a friendly shark, brilliant, meticulous, and relentless in her pursuit of the truth. But she had, by her own choice, walked away from that high-powered career. She'd met Peter at a charity gala, and he had swept her off her feet. He was everything she wasn't. Charming, gregarious, a natural-born salesman who could make anyone feel like the most important person in the room. He ran his own private equity firm, Graves Capital, and was on paper wildly successful. Allison chose to channel all of her intelligence and meticulous energy into her new life as a wife and mother. She ran the Northwood PDA budget. She managed the family's complex investments, and she created a home that was nothing short of a sanctuary for her 2 children, 10-year-old Ben and 8-year-old Emily. Her friends describe her as the anchor of their social circle. If you had a problem, you went to Allison. She would listen, and then she would, with a calm, quiet efficiency, help you map out a 5-step plan to solve it. She was a planner, a fixer, a woman who left nothing to chance. Peter Graves, at 44, was her perfect counterpart. He was the charismatic face of their family. Where Allison was the engine, Peter was a polished, gleaming exterior. He coached Ben's little league team. He sat on the board of the local hospital, and he was famous for his impromptu neighborhood barbecues. Everyone loved Peter. He had that rare, magnetic quality that made people trust him. He looked you in the eye. He remembered your kids' names. And when he told you your money was safe with him, you believed him. Their marriage was, for over a decade, the gold standard of Northwood. They were a team. Peter made the money and Allison, with her financial world background, managed it. It was a partnership they both bragged about. But in the last 2 years, something had begun to change. Those closest to Allison noticed a subtle, almost imperceptible shift. The light in her eyes seemed to dim. She was quieter at dinner parties, her easy laugh a little more forced. When a friend, Sarah, asked her if everything was okay, Allison waved it off with a practiced smile. "Just tired," she'd say. "Peter's working so hard. The kids are a handful. You know how it is." But Sarah didn't know, because Allison wasn't just tired. She was consumed by a cold, creeping dread, the kind of dread that only a woman trained to find numerical impossibilities could feel. It had started small. An irregularity on a credit card statement she managed, a charge for a high-end hotel in New York, on a night Peter was supposedly on a business trip in Chicago. When she'd asked him about it, he'd laughed it off. "Oh, the corporate card must have gotten mixed up with a personal one. I'll have my assistant fix it." But he never did. And Allison, the forensic accountant, knew a brushed-off answer when she heard one. That single, small charge was a loose thread. And Allison, being Allison, began to pull. Late at night, after Peter was asleep, she would go to her home office, the inner sanctum where she managed their lives, and she began to do what she did best. She began to audit her own husband. She opened a new, secret email address. She began to quietly run credit checks. She started digging into the statements for accounts Peter managed exclusively, accounts she had, in the haze of love and trust, given him sole discretion over. And that's when her world fell apart. IT wasn't just one hotel charge. It was hundreds. It was jewelry stores she had never set foot in. It was dinners at restaurants she had only read about. It was a recurring, 4-figure monthly payment to a high-end leasing company for a luxury apartment in Brooklyn. Peter Graves wasn't just having an affair. He was living a complete, parallel life. She found the name Jessica Riley, a 28-year-old art gallery assistant. Allison found her social media. She was beautiful, young, and, in a gut-wrenching twist, she was wearing a diamond tennis bracelet that Allison recognized, one she had assumed Peter was holding as a surprise for her upcoming anniversary. The emotional betrayal was a physical blow, but Allison, the accountant, didn't stop digging. Because the emotional betrayal was only half of the story. She discovered that Peter's wildly successful firm, Graves Capital, was a house of cards. He hadn't landed a major client in 3 years. His big wins were smoke and mirrors. He was, in fact, hemorrhaging money. And how was he funding his double life? How was he paying for the Brooklyn apartment, the jewelry, the $1,000 dinners? He was stealing. He was stealing from their joint accounts. He was stealing from their children's college funds. He had taken out a second mortgage on their Northwood home, forging Allison's signature on the documents. He hadn't just broken her heart. He had systematically, and with cold-blooded precision, been bankrupting his own family to fund his fantasy. The man she had built her life with wasn't just a cheater. He was a con man, a fraud, and he had been playing her, the forensic accountant, for a fool. Most women would have confronted him in a storm of rage and tears. Most would have thrown his clothes on the perfect lawn and called a lawyer. But Allison Graves was not most women. The grief was there, a cold, heavy stone in her stomach. But overriding the grief was a different emotion. It was a cold, calculating, and utterly silent fury. The friendly shark was back. He hadn't just betrayed her, he had underestimated her. And he was about to find out what a fatal mistake that was. Allison didn't cry. She didn't scream. She began to plan. This wasn't just going to be a divorce. This was going to be a systematic, surgical dismantling. This was going to be her revenge. For the next 6 months, Allison Graves lived a double life that put her husband to shame. By day, she was a perfect Northwood wife. She hosted a charity luncheon. She organized a school spring fair. She smiled at Peter over the dinner table, a masterful performance of normalcy. But by night, she was a one-woman investigative unit. Her home office became her war room. She was no longer a victim. She was a prosecutor building her case. She used encrypted hard drives. She bought a burner phone. She met in secret with the most notoriously ruthless divorce attorney in the state. Her lawyer, a woman named Sharon Mills, would later say she had never seen anything like it. Allison didn't come in with tearful accusations. She came in with a 3-inch binder, tabbed and color-coded. It contained every fake expense report Peter had ever filed. It had the wire transfer confirmations to the shell company he'd set up to buy his mistress's apartment. It had the forged signature on the second mortgage, with a handwriting expert's preliminary analysis. It had a complete, audited trail of every single dollar he had stolen from their children. But she wasn't done. This wasn't just about the money. It was about justice. Her lawyer advised her that this evidence was enough to ruin him in civil court. But Allison knew Peter. He was a cornered animal. He was dangerous. She started to feel a prickle of genuine fear. She rented a new, modest apartment in a town 30 miles away under a fake name. She slowly and with painstaking care began to move her most precious, sentimental belongings into a storage unit. Then she did the one thing that would ultimately seal her fate and his. She created a dead man switch. She compiled all of her most damning evidence. The bank statements, the forged documents, the photos of Peter and his mistress, the address of the secret apartment, into a single, password-protected file. She wrote a long, detailed letter, a narrative of her entire investigation, her fears, and her final conclusion. It began with the words, "If you are reading this, I am missing or I am dead." It was Peter. She uploaded this file to a cloud server, and she sent an email to her sister, Laura, the one person in the world she trusted. The email itself was innocuous. The subject line read, "Emily's summer camp options." But the body of the email contained a string of numbers and letters, a complex password, and a single instruction. "If you don't hear from me for more than 24 hours, call the police." Give them this. Her revenge plan was complete. She had her escape route. She had her evidence. She had her insurance policy. She was finally ready. On Tuesday, October 12th, she spent the morning finalizing the transfer of a small, secret inheritance from her grandmother into a new bank account that Peter knew nothing about. It was her escape fund. Her children were at school. Peter was at his office, likely lying to another client. Allison sat at her desk, took a deep, steadying breath, and picked up her phone. She was done hiding. She was done planning. It was time to pull the trigger. She sent a text to Peter. "We need to talk." Peter, sensing the shift in her tone, texted back almost immediately. "Everything okay? I'm swamped." Allison replied, "I'll be home. We need to talk. Tonight." Then, just to make sure he understood, to make sure he knew that the game was over, she sent one more message. A photograph. It was a picture of the diamond tennis bracelet on the wrist of his 28-year-old mistress. She put her phone down. The trap was set. We can only imagine the pure, unadulterated panic that must have seized Peter Graves. He was a man who had built his entire identity on a foundation of lies, and that foundation had just been vaporized. He left his office in a blind panic. He drove home, his mind racing. What did she know? Did she know about the affair? Or did she know about the money? Or, in his worst nightmare, did she know everything? He walked into their beautiful Northwood home around 3 p.m. The house was quiet. Allison was waiting for him. She wasn't in the kitchen, crying. She was in his home office, sitting behind his desk. And the desk was covered from end to end with papers, printouts of bank statements, credit card bills, the forged mortgage documents, a large, glossy photo of the Brooklyn apartment building. She didn't scream. She didn't yell. She just looked at him, her eyes cold with a clarity he had never seen before. "It's over, Peter," she said, her voice calm. "I know about Jessica. I know about the apartment. And I know about the fraud. I know you've been stealing from our children." In that moment, Peter Graves saw his entire world evaporate. He wasn't just facing a divorce. He was facing public humiliation. He was facing financial ruin. He was facing prison. The man who had conned everyone, the charismatic golden boy of Northwood, was a fraud. And his wife, the one person he had dismissed as a simple homemaker, the one person he had so profoundly underestimated, had just checkmated him. He had two choices. He could accept his fate, beg for mercy, and face the consequences. Or he could silence the one person who held the key to his destruction. Peter Graves was a man of control, and in that moment he lost it completely. The charm, the charisma, the practiced smile, it all dissolved, revealing the desperate, narcissistic monster beneath. He lunged at her. The struggle was brief, but brutal. Allison fought back, just as her friends knew she would. She was a fighter. She scratched, she clawed. She fought for her life and for the future of her children. But Peter, fueled by a primal narcissistic rage, was stronger. It was a crime, not a passion, but of cold, calculated self-preservation. He couldn't let her talk. He couldn't let her leave that room. When it was over, the office was silent. Peter Graves stood over the body of his wife, the architect of his ruin, and his only thought was, cover up. He was methodical. He wrapped Allison's body in a heavy-duty tarp from the garage. He placed her in the trunk of her own SUV. He went back into the office and, in a blind panic, he began to clean. He wiped down every surface. He shredded the papers on the desk. He grabbed her laptop, her purse, and her phone. He had to create a new narrative. The narrative of a wife who had snapped, who had run away. He waited until after dark. He drove her SUV to a remote, heavily wooded state park about 40 miles away, a place he knew from family hikes. He dragged her body deep into the dense undergrowth and buried her in a shallow, hastily dug grave. Then, he drove her car to the long-term parking lot at the nearby regional airport. He wiped the car down inside and out and tossed her keys and her purse onto the passenger seat to make it look like she had left in a hurry, like she had fled. He walked 2 miles to a gas station and called a taxi, paying in cash for the ride back to his neighborhood. He walked the final mile home, slipping back into his perfect house like a ghost. He took a shower. He poured himself a very large, very stiff drink. He sat in the silence of his kitchen, his heart pounding, and he began to rehearse his new story. The next morning, when Emily's ballet school called to say Allison had never arrived, Peter Graves played the part of confused and then deeply worried husband. He called Allison's friends. He called her sister. And finally, he called 911 to report his wife, Allison Graves, as missing. He told the responding officers a tragic, convincing story. He told them their marriage was in a rough patch. He admitted, with a performer's shame, that he'd been unfaithful, that Allison had just found out. He showed them the text. "We need to talk. We had a terrible fight," he said, his voice cracking with practiced grief. She just snapped. She said she needed to get away. She took her car and she left. I don't know where she is. I'm terrified she's done something to herself." He had created the perfect story. The vindictive wife, distraught over an affair, had run away. He was the grieving, guilty husband left behind. He had silenced his wife. He had destroyed the evidence. He believed he had committed the perfect murder. He had forgotten about one thing. He had forgotten about the email. The Northwood Police Department initially treated Allison's disappearance just as Peter had planned. As a domestic dispute, a voluntary missing person, a distraught wife, overwhelmed by her husband's infidelity, had simply walked away. The discovery of her car at the airport seemed to confirm this. The detectives assigned to the case, a seasoned investigator named Frank Russo, felt it was an open and shut case of marriage imploding. He'd seen it a dozen times. Peter Graves was a picture of a shattered man. He was cooperative. He cried. He freely admitted his failings as a husband, painting himself as a man desperate to find his wife and atone for his sins. He had an answer for everything. But there was one person who wasn't buying it. Allison's sister, Laura. Laura knew her sister. She knew Allison was a fighter, not a flight risk. She knew Allison, a forensic accountant, would never just walk away. And she knew that Allison would never, under any circumstances, abandon her children. On the third day of Allison's disappearance, Laura, her hands shaking, walked into the Northwood police station and demanded to speak to Detective Russo. "You're looking for the wrong thing," she said, her voice trembling with anger and grief. She didn't run away. He killed her. Russo was skeptical. This was a common, emotional accusation in cases like this. "Ms. Evans," he said gently, "we have no evidence of foul play. Her husband is cooperating." "He's not cooperating," Laura shot back. "He's performing." Allison knew he was dangerous. "She told me." And then she delivered the words that changed everything. "She sent me an email 2 months ago. The subject line was Emily's summer camp options. She told me to give it to the police if she ever went missing. She said it would explain everything." A chill ran down Russo's spine. This was new. They brought Laura to a computer. She logged into her email. She found the message. And there it was, a complex password and a link to a cloud server. A police cybercrimes expert was called in. The password was entered. A single, protected zip file appeared on the screen. The file was clicked, and Allison Graves spoke from beyond the grave. The detectives in that room stood in stunned silence. IT wasn't a letter. It was a prosecution. It was, as her lawyer had described, a 3-inch binder, digitized and annotated. There were the forged mortgage documents, the statements from the secret bank accounts, with Allison's own neat, red-line notes in the margins. There were spreadsheets, created by Allison, detailing every single dollar Peter had siphoned from the family. There were photos of Peter and Jessica Riley, kissing outside the Brooklyn apartment, photos of the jewelry. And then there was a final file, a text document titled My Testimony. It was a 20-page affidavit written by Allison in her own calm, analytical, and devastating voice. It detailed her discovery, her investigation, and her growing, profound fear of her husband. She wrote, "Peter is a narcissist and a sociopath. He has built his life on a lie, and he will do anything to protect it. He is not just unfaithful. He is a criminal. He has stolen our children's future. I am gathering this evidence to leave him and to make sure my children are safe. He has no idea that I know the full extent of his crimes. I am afraid that when he finds out, he will not let me leave. He is a man of control, and he is about to lose it. If you are reading this, he has silenced me. Please, do not let him get away with it. Get justice for Ben and Emily." Detective Russo felt the blood drain from his face. This wasn't a missing person case. This was a premeditated murder, and the victim had just handed them her killer on a silver platter. The entire investigation pivoted on a dime. Peter Graves went from being the grieving husband to the prime and only suspect. The narrative he had so carefully crafted was instantly incinerated. Now Russo's team moved fast. Armed with Allison's dossier, they obtained warrants for everything. Peter's personal financials, his car's GPS, his cell phone tower data. And the cover-up began to unravel with astonishing speed. They found the GPS data from Peter's own car. On the night of the murder, after he had ditched Allison's SUV at the airport, his car's GPS had been turned off, but his cell phone data was still pinging. And it placed him on a 2-mile walk from the airport to a gas station and then in a taxi, which dropped him off a mile from his own home, exactly as he had planned. But he had made a mistake. He had turned off the GPS in his own car, but he had forgotten about the car's built-in emergency services, the kind that automatically track a vehicle. The detectives subpoenaed the car manufacturer, and they found it. A single, deleted trip from that same night, a trip Peter had taken before he went to the airport. A 40-mile drive to Pine Barrens State Park and a 40-mile drive back, with the car remaining stationary in a remote parking lot for exactly 58 minutes. Detective Russo assembled a massive search and rescue team. They descended on the park, guided by the GPS coordinates. For 6 agonizing hours, they scoured the dense woods. Finally, a cadavered dog got a hit in a quiet, secluded ravine, far off any marked trail. There, in a shallow grave, they found the tarp, and inside they found Allison. Peter Graves was brought into the interrogation room, still clinging to his story of the runaway wife. He was calm, composed, and ready to perform. Detective Russo let him talk for 10 minutes. Let him spin his web of lies, his practiced grief. Then, Russo walked to the whiteboard in the room. He wrote, "Emily's summer camp options." Peter's face went white. The mask didn't just slip, IT shattered. Russo continued. He laid out the printouts from Allison's file, the bank statements, the photos of Jessica. "We know about the fraud, Peter," Russo said, his voice flat. "We know about the forged mortgage. We know about the apartment." Peter was visibly shaking, speechless. And then, Russo said, placing a final glossy 8x10 photo on the table, "We found this." It was a picture of the search team at the state park, at the exact coordinates from his car's GPS, unearthing the tarp. Peter Graves stared at the photo. The con was over. The game was over. But the final, undeniable nail came from Allison herself. The autopsy report was definitive. The cause of death was strangulation. And in her desperate, final fight for life, she had scratched her attacker deeply. Under Allison Graves' fingernails, the lab found traces of skin and blood. The DNA was a perfect 1 in a billion match. To Peter Graves. The trial of Peter Graves for first-degree murder of his wife was a media sensation. It was dubbed the Northwood Nightmare. The courtroom was packed every single day, a standing-room-only theater for the final. Public destruction of a man who had fooled an entire community. The victims were everywhere. Allison's grieving family, her children now orphans, were in the front row. And behind them sat the dozens of families Peter had conned, the friends and neighbors who had trusted him with their life savings, only to find he had stolen it all to fund his sordid double life. The prosecution, led by a sharp, methodical agent named Maria Lopez, knew they had a mountain of evidence. But their strategy was simple. Let Allison tell the story. In her opening statement, Lopez held up a printed copy of Allison's 20-page testimony. "For the next 3 weeks," she told the jury, "you are going to hear from experts, from detectives, and from the people who loved Allison Graves. But the most important witness you will hear from is Allison herself. You will hear her voice in her own words as she meticulously and with heartbreaking clarity investigated her own husband. This is not just a murder trial. This is a reading of a report, a final, brilliant audit, conducted by a woman who knew her killer better than anyone else. A report she wrote knowing it might be the last thing she ever did. The trial was devastating. The prosecution walked the jury, step by step, through Allison's investigation. They presented the financial crimes first, with expert analysts confirming every single one of Allison's findings. Peter had stolen over $2.4 million. His firm was a complete fraud. The motive was clear. Peter wasn't just losing a wife. He was facing total public and criminal ruin. Allison's sister, Laura, took the stand in a gut-wrenching testimony, recounting the day she received that cryptic email and her growing, terrifying realization that her sister was in mortal danger. But the most powerful moments came when the prosecutor read excerpts from Allison's own words, projected onto a screen for the jury to see. They heard her voice, her intelligence, her fear. "I am afraid of what he will do when he realizes I know everything." Peter Graves' defense team was cornered, and they knew it. They couldn't deny the infidelity. They couldn't deny the fraud. They couldn't deny the DNA. They were left with only one possible, desperate defense, a crime of passion. They tried to argue for manslaughter, not murder. They painted Allison as a vindictive, cold, and calculating woman who, upon discovering the affair, hadn't just gotten angry. She had set out to destroy her husband. The defense attorney argued that on that terrible afternoon, Allison hadn't just confronted Peter. She had taunted him. She had laid out her revenge plan, detailing how she would ruin him, take his kids, and send him to prison. Peter Graves snapped. The attorney yelled, his face red. He was a man pushed too far, a man who saw his entire life being ripped away by a woman bent on revenge. IT wasn't premeditated. It was a tragedy, a spontaneous, horrific, human tragedy. It was a plausible narrative, but it had one fatal flaw. The prosecutor, Maria Lopez, stood up for a cross-examination of Peter, who had foolishly and arrogantly taken the stand to perform one last time. He wept. He talked about how much he loved his kids. He claimed Allison's coldness had driven him to the affair. He repeated the defense's narrative. She pushed me. She was screaming at me, telling me she would destroy me. I just lost control. I didn't mean to. I never meant to hurt her. Lopez let him finish. Then she walked calmly toward the witness box. You snapped, Mr. Graves? She asked, her voice quiet. Yes, he sobbed. IT was a spontaneous act of rage. Yes, God, yes. Then can you explain this? She asked, placing a new document on the projector. It was his internet search history from his work computer. On the morning before the murder, just minutes after Allison had sent him the photograph of the bracelet. The search terms lit up the courtroom. How to permanently delete files from a home server. How long does it take to file a missing person report? Best way to disable car GPS tracking. Pine Barren State Park soil composition. The courtroom was dead silent. Peter's face froze. The blood drained from it. Lopez's voice was like ice. You claim you snapped at 3 p.m., Mr. Graves. But this evidence shows that at 10:30 a.m., you were already planning the cover-up. You weren't a husband who snapped. You were an executioner planning his disposal. You were just waiting for the right time to silence the one person who could expose you for the fraud you are. Weren't you? Peter said nothing. His mask was gone. The jury saw the monster. After a 4-week trial, the jury deliberated for just 45 minutes. It was one of the fastest murder verdicts in the state's history. The foreman stood. On the charge of murder in the first degree, we the jury find the defendant, Peter Graves, guilty. A wave of raw, gasping sobs erupted from Allison's family. Peter Graves simply stared ahead, a man hollowed out, his final performance a catastrophic failure. Peter Graves was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was also found guilty on multiple counts of fraud and embezzlement, ensuring that even if he had somehow escaped the murder charge, he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. The fallout in Northwood was immediate and devastating. The families Peter had defrauded lost nearly everything. The perfect community was forced to reckon with the fact that a monster had been living in plain sight, coaching their children's baseball games and shaking their hands at charity events. The beautiful colonial home on the tree-lined street sat empty for years, a dark monument to the lies it had been built on. Peter's mistress, Jessica Riley, was never charged with any crime. She, too, was a victim of his manipulation. He had told her he was in the final stages of a divorce. She lost her apartment, her reputation, and was hounded by the media for months, her life forever intertwined with a brutal murder. But the true victims, of course, were Ben and Emily. In a single horrific day, they lost their mother to a brutal act of violence, and their father to his own monstrous ego. They were placed in the custody of Allison's sister, Laura, who has dedicated her life to raising them, to surrounding them with love, and to ensuring they remember their mother for the brilliant, courageous woman she was, not for the tragedy of her death. Allison's revenge plan, as the media called, was never really about revenge. It was about protection. It was a mother's desperate, meticulous, and brilliant plan to protect her children, to secure their future, and to ensure that the man who betrayed them would not get away with it. In the end, The story of Allison and Peter Graves is a chilling, heartbreaking tragedy. It's a story about the terrifying, fragile facade we build and the dark rot that can fester just beneath the most perfect, polished surfaces. It's a reminder that we can live next to someone, sleep next to someone, and build an entire life with someone and never truly know the darkness they are capable of. Allison Graves was a woman who saw the truth when everyone else was blinded by the performance. Her greatest strength, her meticulous, analytical mind, was the very thing that uncovered the lie, and in doing so, IT signed her own death warrant. But in her final courageous act, Allison made a choice. She knew she was facing a monster, and she knew she might not survive the confrontation. So she did the only thing she could. She prepared. She meticulously laid a trail of breadcrumbs, a path of evidence, a final report that would not only expose her killer, but convict him. She was silenced, but she refused to be silent. Her last text message wasn't just, "We need to talk." Her true, final message to the world was her testimony, a voice that reached out from beyond the grave, to have the last word and to secure the final irrefutable and devastating justice.